Hi guys, it's Karl here from Mantella Environmental Education. Now as you can see, I'm in a local woodland. In this video we're going to look at some of the wildlife, some of the biodiversity that we can find in woodland habitats in the autumn time. Now a lot of people think if you want to see wildlife you've got to go out in the spring or the summer months when the birds are singing. They're easier to find and identify. It's quite warm, it's nicer weather to go out anyway. And also there's lots of insects and mini beasts that are very active, like bees and wasps and butterflies and things like that. But autumn time is a really interesting time to come out and look for wildlife as well. So we're going to be focusing in this video at looking at some of the trees behind us, and looking at the different colours of the leaves and explaining why those leaves change colour, and also look at another really cool aspect of biodiversity in woodlands, which are fungi. That's the mushrooms and the toadstools. So the first thing you'll notice when you go into woodlands in the autumn are all the leaves that are starting to fall off at this time of the year, and they go really nice colours in the autumn. So this is beech, nice oval shaped leaves with a pointy tip, and they go a lovely coppery orange brown in the autumn time. And if it's a mild autumn, they usually stay on the trees, but because we've had a few autumn storms this year already, most of them have blown off the trees. You can see a few just hanging on here behind me, and the next storm they'll probably get blown off the tree. Now the reason why these leaves change colour from green in the summer to this coppery orange colour in the autumn is beech trees are what's called deciduous trees, which means they lose their leaves in the autumn. So we're going to see some evergreen tree species in the woodlands here, and they keep their leaves or their needles all throughout the year, so they always look green. And they just have a different strategy for surviving the cold, stormy, sometimes really cold and frosty and snowy winters that we have here in Northern Ireland. But beech and other deciduous tree species like oak, ash and maple and hazel and alder, they all drop their leaves in the autumn. And the reason for that is leaves, you see, they're really thin, and they get really easily damaged by wind, which can rip them. That allows disease in, things like bacteria and fungi, which won't be very good for the tree. And it also means that frost can get in there. Frost can damage these really delicate thin leaves, and so the tree prevents getting disease or frost entering these leaves in the autumn and the winter time by dropping them all off. So that's what deciduous trees do in the autumn time. Now to do that, they need to take all the nutrients that are in the leaves that have built up in those leaves during the spring and summer. They pull them out of the leaves, that goes down the trunk into the roots underneath the ground, where they're kept nice and safe from predators, things that might want to tap into the tree and steal some of that nice sugary nutrients that the tree has built up throughout spring and summer months. So they do that by pulling a green chemical called chlorophyll out of the leaves in the autumn time, and when that green colour disappears, you can see some of the other colours that are hiding in the leaf that are masked by that dominant green colour. And in beech, that's the coppery orange brown colours. So different tree species, as we're going to see, have different autumnal colours of leaves, which makes them quite easy to identify. Now I've mentioned that beech and a lot of our other woodland plants are deciduous. Well, here is a woodland species which is evergreen. It always has its leaves, and it always has green leaves throughout the year. This is ivy. This is a really common climbing vine that you find in woodlands, and this is a young leaf which has 5 points on it. So this is a young ivy. Later on we'll have a little look at a mature ivy leaf, which is actually more of a kite shape. So ivy leaves actually change shape depending on whether they're young or they're old. And ivy is an evergreen species. Now that's quite important if you live in the woodlands and you're something like a bat or a bird or an insect, because it means it always produces some cover on the ground or up in the tree bark, and that provides some evergreen cover where you can roost away at night time, get out of the wind, get out of the rain, and hide. So evergreen plant species in the woodlands like ivy provide birds and small mammals and insects and bats with cover out of the elements, the wind and the rain, to shelter and keep warm. Another evergreen species that's quite common in our woodlands, usually grows in the understory, is this stuff. This is holly. And we'll start to see this appearing all over the place leading up to Christmas time. This is the one that gets the red berries you'll often see in the wreaths, and it usually has really waxy, dark green, prickly leaves. Now, holly is another evergreen species. It doesn't drop its leaves in the autumn and the winter. It keeps these leaves, and the reason those leaves are spiky is to keep things like deer and rabbits from browsing or eating the leaves. And the spikier they are, the more likely they are not to get eaten by a mammal like deer or rabbits. Just a few moments ago about ivy is a really important plant in woodlands, and we looked at those 5 points on the young ivy leaves. Well, these are old or mature ivy leaves. You'll see they're a kite shape, and what these are, these in late summer would have been little white flowers, which are really good for pollinating insects like bees and wasps and hoverflies. But at this time of the year, they're actually turning into blackberries. You can't really see them at the moment, they're still developing, but these blackberries will be on the ivy vines all the way through the late autumn, all the way through winter into early spring, and they're a really valuable source of food for birds. If it's a really hard winter, those black ivy berries can be a really important source of food for birds and small mammals like wood mice. Now, one of the treasures you can find in woodlands in the autumn time are the fungi, or the mushrooms and toadstools. This one has had a little bit of nibbling all over its cap. This particular one with this nice rosy red cap is called the Sickener. It likes to grow beneath beech trees, and it's called the Sickener because if you and I were to try and eat it, it would give us an upset stomach, makes us feel a little bit queasy and a little bit sick. But just because we can't eat it without feeling a bit sick, it doesn't mean that some other woodland animals like slugs and snails can't eat it and feel just fine. And that's exactly what's happened here. You can see it's been browsed or grazed by slugs and snails, and you can actually see through it. So something's had a good munch on that. Nice bit of autumnal food for some woodland invertebrates. And this is a little bit more what it should look like. So you'll see it's got a nice rosy red cap. If we look underneath it, it's got an almost pure white stem, and underneath you'll see these little folds called gills, almost look like the pages of a book. And the Sickener belongs to a group of toadstools or mushrooms called the Brittlegills, because the gills are very easy to snap or break. And there's lots of animals, including fallow deer, that will actually eat these. They're a really good source of food for lots of woodland animals in the autumn, but obviously not us, make us feel a little bit sick. Now, these are only a small part of the fungus. The main part of the fungus actually grows right down here in the soil, out of view, and it has little thread-like whitish roots called hyphae or mycelia that spread all the way through the woodland floor, and they actually interact with the roots of the beech tree. And fungi, like the Sickener here, actually get some of their nutrients from the beech tree, but they also give some nutrients to the beech tree as well, so they kind of share nutrients in a sort of mutual relationship. They're beneficial for each other. And in the autumn time, when it's really, really windy, and also there's not a lot of strong sunlight to dry out these little toadstools, they produce these little fruiting bodies, which we see above ground. And the reason they produce these toadstool or mushroom type structures in the autumn time typically is because this is the time of year where there's not a lot of strong sunlight to dry them out, but also it's really windy. And the fungi, the mushrooms and the toadstools, they don't actually use seeds to disperse themselves across the countryside. They use microscopic spores, which are so small they're almost like dust on the wind. And because it's very windy in the autumn, that helps them to disperse their spores to another area of woodland where they can colonise. The reason I suggested getting out into an older type of woodland here in Northern Ireland for a bit of a walk in the autumn is this: lots of rotting wood. And this might look a little bit untidy to a lot of us, but it's actually, for the woodland, it's actually very beneficial because it provides a little habitat for lots of invertebrates, lots of woodland mini beasts, if you like, things like wood lice, millipedes, and lots of other invertebrates that actually eat the rotting wood, and they break it back down very slowly over a number of years into soil. And as we all know, wood is really, really tough. It's really, really hard. But when the invertebrates, the wood lice and the millipedes and things, break down the wood, you can see it turns into mush. it becomes very, very soft, very easy to break. Now it's not just the wood lice and the millipedes and lots of other little woodland invertebrates that do this. There's also the fungi. The fungi will invade this rotting wood. They soften it by slowly but surely eating it. Lots of the sugars that are trapped in the wood they use as a source of food. The toadstool, this one's called common yellow Brittlegill, and it has this pale yellow cap, whereas the Sickener had this rosy red cap. If you turn it over, it also has that pure white stalk and pure white gills underneath. So this is another one of the Brittlegills. Again, this is not really edible for people, but there's lots of other woodland animal species that can feast on this, like deer and slugs and snails. You can see a little bit of grazing there from slugs and snails on the cap. And what these mushrooms actually do, as well as living in association with the tree roots, like we were saying earlier on, some other fungi actually break down what's behind us here. All these leaves that fall onto the woodland floor in the autumn. Just look at all those different shades and colours. How cool is that? And you'll see the evergreen ivy leaves creeping through it. So do you ever wonder where all these autumn leaves disappear by the time summer comes? Most of them have mysteriously disappeared. The reason for that is all throughout the autumn and the winter and early spring, the fungi, together with a lot of these woodland invertebrates and millipedes and wood lice and so on that munch up the old wood, they also eat fallen leaves. They turn them back into compost or soil. So they're part of nature's recycling team, if you like. So all these leaves, although they're no good to the tree anymore, they've fallen off, they're a source of food for a lot of woodland animals over the quieter months of the year. And come early summer, most of these will have been munched up and turned back into compost or soil, which of course woodland plants, including the beech trees themselves, use to get their nutrients as a source of food. The thing you'll be familiar with in woodlands, on the woodland floor, is this. This is brambles or blackberry bushes, and it has very, very thorny stems, and the leaves appear in 3s or 5s, just like you can see here. Now, a lot of people, it creates something called scrub on the woodland floor, bramble scrub, and a lot of people just think it looks untidy, but it's actually, for the woodland, it's actually a very important part of the woodland, because scrub habitat, such as all this bramble, is actually a tree nursery. That might sound quite strange, but what I mean by that is if you get any young trees, any beech seedlings or saplings trying to grow up from the soil, there's quite a lot of fallow deer on our local woodland here, and they'll, more often than not, nibble a lot of those young beech trees before they get a chance to grow into these big majestic trees you see in the distance there. But the one place that browsing, grazing animals in the woodland like deer and rabbits won't go is into this thorny bramble scrub. Just like when we walk through it, it's rather uncomfortable. They get jagged by these thorns, and so it's a really safe place for young trees to sprout up under the cover of this thorny canopy of bramble. And by the time the deer can get to some of the branches of the trees are big and strong enough to cope with a little bit of browsing from deer or from rabbits. So it looks pretty untidy to a lot of us, all this bramble scrub covering the hillside under the tree canopy here, but it's actually nature's tree nursery. This is easily the most common species of fungi in Northern Ireland. This is called candle snuff fungus. It's a really cool name, and it gets the name because it looks rather like the wick of a candle that's been snuffed out, and it's black at the bottom but white and chalky at the top. And this is one of the woodland fungi species that breaks down that hard wood of trees into soft mushy wood, which eventually decomposes further into soil and compost. Not all fungi you find in woodlands are quite dull colours like our candle snuff. Another species that grows in rotting wood, and it's this bright orangey yellow colour. Often you really have to pay attention to what you're looking at in woodlands, because some fungi, and indeed some animal species and plant species that live in woodlands, are camouflaged. They're cryptically coloured or patterned, so they're quite difficult to see. And here we have a species of fungus that everyone will have heard of, called honey fungus. And the colour of the caps is that nice orangey honey colour. It blends in perfectly with the autumn leaves beneath beech. Now this is a species that's notorious for attacking live trees. So if you're a gardener and you love your ornamental trees, honey fungus is the last thing you want to find growing in your garden. And it doesn't just attack dead trees and turn them down into mushy soil, it also attacks living trees as well. And if you look at the cap, it has little dark brown scales on the top. But most importantly, if you look down on the stalk here, it has a ring, a little papery ring, which helps to identify it as honey fungus. So this is one of the main species in woodland that will break down the wood from fallen trees into compost, and it also attacks living trees and kills them as well. And as awful as that sounds, that's just part of the natural woodland life cycle. So not all trees, just like not all animals, can last forever, and honey fungus are one of the species of fungi that will actually kill living trees over a long period of time. By now you'll probably have worked out that trees and fungi and woodlands are very important for one another. They give each other nutrients. Some fungi will break down wood into soil, which plants like trees can use as food, and some like honey fungi will actually kill the trees as well. And as well as that, a lot of fungi only grow on particular tree species. Some can be very fussy indeed about where they grow and what they eat, just like some people. And this particular one is called jelly ear fungus, and it only grows on the branches of dead and decaying elder, which is a small sort of woody shrub you get in the understory of woodlands. So you can see why it's called jelly ear. It's very, very wet and quite soft, not hard like a lot of other mushrooms. And it's also looks rather like the ear on the side of your head. This is the bark of the beautiful silver birch. You can see it's sort of a silvery white colour. And the little breathing pores aren't little white dots like we had on the holly, they're little horizontal lines. That's those length cells again. And silver birch also gets these nice rusty patches as well, and you can see these dark V's that occur below the branches as well. This white colour is actually produced by the tree as an insecticide. It's quite bitter tasting. It's a chemical called betulin, and it's designed to stop insects boring through the trunk into the inner nutritious interior of the tree. So this white colour is actually a toxin used to keep insects from boring through the bark, and that's what gives it this really attractive appearance. Another bracket fungus or polypore fungus that grows only on silver birch is this beautiful species. This is Birch Polypore, or sometimes called razor strap fungus, because in times gone past people would have sharpened their old style traditional barbers cutthroat razors on the surface of the cap of this fungus, and it only grows on silver birch. You can see, even though this silver birch stump has fallen down, it's lying sideways, that fungus is still growing inside the wood, slowly decomposing it, and it's grown like a shelf, so it's growing horizontally, and no matter which way a tree ends up, and the fungus produces the fruiting bodies in the autumn and the winter time, they'll always orient themselves in this horizontal shelf-like position, and that's so that the spores can drop out of those minute pores on the underside of the bracket down into the wind, and then they get carried away to somewhere new. Like today, one of the ways that we can help our natural ecosystems function better is to reintroduce lost species such as the red kite, the golden eagle and the white-tailed eagle. But sometimes, very, very rarely, a species reintroduces itself into our countryside. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's usually pretty special. And if we zoom in on this dead beech tree, you'll see a hole has been excavated in the trunk, and that's excavated by a great spotted woodpecker. Now, these colourful birds appeared about 15 or 16 years ago in Wicklow, County Wicklow in the southeast of Ireland, all by themselves, after many years of people talking about reintroducing them. And this is a woodland in County Down. They're now found in almost every county in Ireland. And they excavate these burrows in dead or nearly dead hardwood trees. They usually prefer alder, but this one is in a dead, rotting beech. And if we look down the trunk, you can see they've picked off the bark and some of the dead wood, and they're looking for wood-boring beetle grubs in the wood. So these are the feeding signs of great spotted woodpecker, and that's the nesting hole that they used earlier in the year. So that brings us to the end of our short video on some of the things you can see in your local woodlands in the autumn, and many of these things could be seen all the way through the winter into early spring. So hopefully next time you go for a walk in the woods, it'll not just be a walk, you'll be spotting some of the tree and shrub leaves on the forest floor. You know where they go between now and next summer. They get broken down into compost by a whole team of woodland invertebrate species, and the fungi, the amazing fungi as well. And maybe you'll spot some odd mushroom and toadstool species on your walk as well.